Welcome to First in Fiction, your first stop for learning to write fantastic fiction. I am the podcast producer, Molly Jo Riley. I am an author, editor, social media ninja, and author coach. And with us, we have our host, Aaron.
Hello, everybody. I'm Aaron Gansky, author of The Bargain, The Hand of Bad Night series, and Firsts in Fiction.
And we have our new co-host who'd like to introduce you to Tessa Emily Hall. Tessa, introduce yourself to our audience.
Hi, everyone. I am so excited to be part of this podcast. I love this podcast. So I am a YA author of Purple Moon, Unwritten Melody, and Fallen Leaves. And I also have written Coffee Shop Divas, which is a devotional for teens as well. And I work in publishing too. I work as an associate agent for Heartline Literary Agency and a YA acquisitions editor for LPC Books. So I'm very excited to be a part of this podcast.
Great. Well, welcome aboard, Tessa. We're glad you're here.
Thank you.
As before, guys, we want to encourage you to follow us on YouTube. Click the thumbs up icon because that's the equivalent of giving us a good review on Amazon and Goodreads, and it'll help us grow. Share the link with your friends, and as always, look back through our episode archive. I told Aaron that if I messed up, would he record differently, and he said no, so we have to keep going. So this was my stumble for the night. So feel free to look back at our past episodes and also leave us comments with your Ask the Author questions.
You know, it's been a while, so I'm sure our viewers will give us some grace. Molly, I'm not sure if you saw the nice note that Vin left us on our kind of, not our farewell episode, but our final episode where we were kind of talking about the hiatus that we were going to go on. It was, if you get a chance, you need to go check that out. It was an epic comment. I
will. I'll look into that. So, which brings us to, before we get into the podcast, why have we been away? What's been going on? For myself, I took a hiatus before the podcast took a hiatus because I had to work on my book, which I wasn't doing. And Aaron kind of cracked the whip and said, no more extracurricular activities until you get your homework done. So thanks for that, Aaron. And then I woke up one morning last summer and just decided that I was going to move to South Carolina from California. And it took about 3 months of prep work and cleaning out my house, and that's what happened. And so my hiatus was personal so I could get these personal accomplishments done. And now I moved, and now my book is written, and it's in edits, and it'll be available within the next 2 months. Yay! Self-published, so I'm very excited for that. So follow me on social media for all the details. Aaron, why is your dad not here?
Well, the same reason that I went away for a while, and that is life sometimes gets in the way. And he's kind of at a point in his professional career where he's juggling several things. He took on some additional responsibilities, teaching some college courses at Fresno Pacific University, I believe, and that's been taking a significant amount of time. And there's just been some family things going on and some other responsibilities that have come up. And so he took a bit of a hiatus for that so that he could focus on that. And it's just something that has been very time consuming for him. And same with me, my day job has really been super inconvenient this year, far more than any other year. And if you followed the podcast for very long, you probably heard me complaining and whining.
And even if you didn't follow the podcast, you probably heard him complaining and whining.
I'm well known for my complaining and whining. So it's still very busy, but I'm at a point now where the academic year is starting to wind down. We've got into the third quarter here, so we're about to start the fourth quarter, and some of my other responsibilities have slowed up a little bit. I've replaced them with other responsibilities. So. But it was time. I also took this time, and I know I'm taking a lot of time and saying time a lot of times, which I won't go back and edit out.
Where is my red pen?
For reals, right?
How many times do you say that?
That's a lot of times.
Encourage him, Tessa. You haven't been here before, but things like that just won't turn out well for the rest of us.
So I wanted to rethink the podcast. I wanted to give Pops, who, by the way, just the fact that he stepped up when Steve and Heather weren't able to continue. I'm eternally grateful to you, Tessa, for coming on now, for Molly, for all the help that you've provided, for Steve, who started this podcast with me, and Heather, who was a large part of this podcast for so long. I talked with Heather to see if she was at a point in her life where she could come back, and she's unfortunately not. But so many people have contributed to this podcast for so long, and it's been, my personal dream. It's been kind of my brand. It's been my, my platform and all that kind of stuff. But it's really is a labor of love, and just to all the listeners who've been patient with us over the last 5 months, 6 months that we've been off the air. It's good to be back. We missed you guys, and we're excited to bring you some more good content. And we needed to find a format that was going to fit us. So the format that you're going to see is a little bit different. We're not going to do live episodes as much. We're still going to try and fit one in here or there. But for the most part, it's going to be pre-recorded, because that's just it fits our schedules a little bit better. We can kind of do some batch recordings and still give you consistent content, even though our other responsibilities may be pressing. So we're going to be able to do that, and hopefully keep more consistent content coming to you. We still want to be interactive. Please keep sending us your Ask the Author questions. Each episode will be shorter, with the possible exception of this one, because I'm taking 30 minutes just to explain why our shows are going to be shorter, which is, I guess that's some sort of irony. But yeah, we'll have shorter episodes, a little more to the point, and it's going to be good. We're really excited, Tessa, to have you along to provide some new insights. One thing that I love about having you here is the fact that you are not only an accomplished award-winning author. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. So accomplished award-winning author. You are, you work on the agenting side and on the editing side. So you see the publishing industry from a variety of angles, and that's going to be really valuable for our listeners.
Yes. Yeah, I'm so excited to be here. Thanks again, Aaron, for just having me on board. I've loved this podcast for years, so it's really cool to be on this side of it now. So
yeah, awesome. Well, we're glad to have you. So, Molly, you're doing a little bit something different too. You're going to take on kind of more of the job that I'm currently doing, but kind of the MC, kind of the host type responsibility.
Rude, but now that it is my official job, I'm going to be rude. Aaron, you need to be quiet so I can do my job.
I appreciate that.
I am taking on more of a facilitator role, which has been just a wonderful title that has been thrown at me from different and various aspects with this author writing coaching career. So I'm very happy with that. And just basically doing what I was doing previously, monitoring the chat room. Well, now I will be monitoring the comments on our social medias as well. But on the podcast, I will be the MC/facilitator, which means that I get to watch the clock most of the time. I will introduce, I will ask questions, and I will lead the discussion, sort of like a moderator at a political campaign, although I really am sad I just kind of classified it like that. So moving on, we're going to say right off the bat, thanks for joining us. And our first Ask the Author question. This question comes to us from Molly in South Carolina. Molly says, how important is identifying your genre, especially for indie or self-publishing authors? And is it okay to blend genre or break the rules? Tess, what is your response?
Well, I wonder who the Molly person is. She sounds like a really interesting person.
I don't know. Somebody who's got confused about writing maybe shouldn't even be just like, maybe she has to watch the podcast.
So this is actually a question that I get asked pretty often about branding. And I think it is important to stick with a specific brand for your entire writing career. And that means that if you write in a certain genre, then you kind of want to be known in that genre in a way that reflects your specific author brand. And a lot of authors, when they want to write in, separate genres, then they will write underneath a different pen name. But I have seen some authors who can pull it off well, who can write in multiple genres, and they still have that loyal readership. But I would suggest for new authors, try at least to get to just focus on one genre at first and become known in that genre. And if in the future you want to experiment with other genres, then maybe you can, you can consider a pen name or another way to do it. Because I know my favorite author is Karen Kingsbury, who's known as the Queen of Christian Fiction. And she, of course, she writes in the women's fiction, Christian fiction genre, and is contemporary fiction. But she also writes a few children's books, and it's okay because she's able to do that in a way that still reflects her brand. And her other books are inspirational. They have like a Hallmark sort of a feel, which is why a lot of her books have been produced into Hallmark movies. And her children's books are the same way. They reflect her as an author. And also know she wrote a series called the Angels Walking series that has a little bit of supernatural elements incorporated, but she did this in a way that didn't veer away from her brand. So I think it is important, though, as a new author, to first establish yourself, just identify what it is that you specifically want to write, and understand how you can brand yourself, even though it might shift, it might change the more that you write. So if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Aaron, what would your response be to that?
I'm always an advocate of challenging traditional rules if you're doing it for a particular reason, like if the story demands it, if that makes sense. I'm not a fan of breaking the rules for the sake of breaking the rules and being cool and edgy and trying to be, avant-garde. It seems at that point that you're not telling a story, you're just trying to show off, and that's never the point of good fiction. I think there are several books that defy genres. Slaughterhouse-Five by Kurt Vonnegut Jr. But that's, the exception to the rule. I know publishers really like things to be in particular genres because they know certain publishers market to certain readerships. A contemporary women's fiction publisher is not going to look at my YA fantasy because that's not who their readership is. They don't know how to market it, those types of things. And so if you're writing a book that seems to fit well into a genre, great. If you're writing a book that, for the sake of story, is somewhere in between, it's not the end of the world, as long as you're true to the story. And really, if you're self-publishing, you've got a lot of options because you don't have to worry about what the publisher is going to say or not. But if you're planning on pitching your book to publishers, it's going to be a little bit easier if it does fall within those traditional kind of contemporary genre guidelines, because it makes it easier for the publisher to understand how they're going to approach sales and how they're going to approach marketing. So that's my very long-winded way of saying it depends on what your goal is for the book. As a writer, my first and foremost responsibility is to the story. And if the story doesn't fit in traditional genres, then let it not fit in traditional genres. Just understand that may be a deal breaker for a lot of publishers.
Yeah, and one other point to make too is that I write both fiction and nonfiction, but in this case, it's fine because it's the same audience. I have the same teen audience with both books, and all of my books, my brand is pretty much, I want to offer inspirational books for teenagers, and that is carried across all my books, whether it's fiction or nonfiction. And I think the main thing is publishers want to see that you have a loyal readership and a loyal audience that can carry with you throughout your career.
Good.
This just in from Molly in South Carolina. She says, thank you very much for that information. Very informative and helpful.
She's welcome.
Are you just channeling her spirit over there? Or telepathy?
I can hear her in your ears.
It's like she's in my head. Okay, so tonight's topic is beginning with backstory, how a character's backstory can shape plot events. And Aaron, before we delve into that, as your dad would always say, for new writers or new listeners, let's define the topic. So Aaron, go ahead and tell our audience what exactly is backstory.
So when we talk about backstory, what we're talking about is the story that takes place way back for your character. That was a stretch there. But the idea is,
Wow.
I know, stick with me. It's been a while. I'm rusty.
It's been a while. I've forgotten some of this.
Yeah, it doesn't get any better. Just be glad you're not one of my students who have to deal with my terrible puns.
Every day.
Every day. Baseball season is in full swing. Backstory. So the backstory is the story of your character. that has led them to the point of the beginning of the novel. So it's typically what has transpired in your character's life before page one of your novel. Now, it's not always shown within the pages. Sometimes you'll get flashbacks and things like that, but more often than not, it's kind of left as a mystery. You have your character who begins, and they are a particular person because of some of the things that have transpired in their history. It has formed them, it has shaped them, and as they move forward, the readers will sometimes get a sense of that, to get a sense of what has happened to them, what has shaped them. But specifically, we're just talking about the events that have shaped the character into the character that they currently are when we first are introduced to them on page one.
Okay. Tess, can you describe how developing a character's history can create a well-rounded, authentic character?
Yeah, so basically, when we meet people in person, we can only know them based on the way that they present themselves to us. We don't know everything about their past. We don't know their story. But we can only see the results of that story, of their history. So we can only see how their history has shaped them into the person that they are today. It's not until we dig a little deeper and begin to ask questions about their past that things start to come up, and you start, to hear about why they are the way that they are, the kind of family that they grew up in, why they have certain fears that they have. And this is the same with our characters. We want our readers, of course, at first, just to get to know our characters, and just like we would in real life, the way that we get to know people in real life. But as time goes on, as your readers stick with them a little bit more, they'll start to realize the reason that they are the way that they are. And as authors, we can develop all this before we begin writing our book. That way, we can get to know the characters' history, and discover who they are today by discovering who they were yesterday. And that way, when we start writing our stories, our characters are going to be fleshed out. They're going to be living and breathing people rather than just characters. They're not going to have traits that we assign them just for the sake of the story, but they're going to make sense, just like our traits and our personality and our worldview has all been shaped because of our past and because of the decisions that we made in the past and because of how our upbringing and that sort of thing. So it's really important to spend the necessary time in developing these characters, even before they walk on stage, onto our pages or on stage.
Same thing. So when we're developing, and this is for both of you, but when we're developing the backstory, do we give all of that information to the readers throughout the book, or is that just for our knowledge as to how these characters act, perform, think? Or do we share that with, like you were talking through flashbacks, how much do we share with the audience?
Yeah, well, again, like whenever we meet people in real life, we don't know their entire story right whenever we meet them, but it might reveal itself organically the more that we get to know them, the more that we hang out with them a little bit more, but we just see the results of that. And the same should be with our characters. As authors, we should know them so well that we know who they were yesterday, but these things don't necessarily make their way into the story, only if it is for the sake of pushing the story forward or for the sake of characterization. But if we give too much information about their backstory, then that comes across as telling rather than showing. But it's still important for us authors to understand why they are the way that they are, and if there's a time while we're writing, so an opportunity presents itself for us to reveal a little bit of that backstory, then that's fine. But we shouldn't just squeeze it into the story just so the reader can know, because that's called an info dump, a narrative. I can't think of the word. Narrative something. Not narrative.
Oh,
narrative.
I got you. Yeah.
Oh wait, no. Resist. I'm thinking of the rule. Resist the urge to explain.
Right.
That's the rule that we should follow as writers. We should resist the urge to over-explain and to tell instead of show.
It is one of those conundrums. You'll spend several days, sometimes weeks, planning out a character, developing them, looking through their history, figuring out what their favorite drink is, what their favorite food is, what their favorite movie is. These types of things that may or may not even play a part in the story, but you go through this exercise of developing your characters, and it feels as if you write that novel and that stuff doesn't come into play, you feel like maybe you've wasted your time. You actually haven't. What the payoff is, the fact that you know will inform the way you write, and you will write more confidently and more specifically, and you won't shy away from specific details that are going to need to be included, and some things you'll find a way to weave in, and some things are not going to be relevant and you're just not going to include them. But knowing your character's backstory is important, because if you don't, what you end up with are characters who do not behave in a believable way, and characters who do strange things, and there's a lot of vague, ethereal details because you're afraid to make anything specific because you just don't understand exactly what would happen at this particular moment. So it's important to know. You don't have to know it for the waitress who walks on scene to serve coffee, but you need to know the backstory of your major protagonists, and I would say your antagonists if you have particular antagonists.
Just a little off side note here. It's not in the show notes, but Aaron, and I hope you'll remember this. About 2 years ago, when you were mentoring me through NOLA, and I was going through the final stages of the final draft before sending it off to editors and whatnot, before I set it aside for a year. And I was about 2/3 through working on the book. And I remember texting you and saying, why didn't you tell me that my character is this? And I don't want to say it because I want it to be, it's in the book. And you wrote back and you said, well, I thought you knew. I said, how would I know that? And you said, well, you're the one who wrote it.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of characters will reveal themselves if you write them true to what you know them to be.
Yep. And
even me writing it, it absolutely got my attention, just even writing it, because I didn't know this about my character. It was something that wasn't discussed. I didn't plan it. It just evolved. And yet looking at it now, of course, her history, the backstory shows that that's exactly how she would be or how she would act. And I just remember that kind of took me by surprise. And I just remember texting you saying, you've been reading this, you've been mentoring me through this book. Why didn't you tell me my character was like this? And you're like, oh, because you should already know. So I think fundamentally when we do the backstories as authors, we are aware of it, and it will show through the writing whether it's intentional or not.
And that I think leads us to perhaps the next point, or what may be the next point, and that is, how much backstory do you include and before you start writing? So do you need to know your character's entire history and entire backstory before you begin writing the novel or the novels? And I think this kind of goes back to the idea of, are you a discovery writer or are you an outliner? I am notoriously a discovery writer, but I've been doing a lot more outlining these days. And recently I just kind of went through a character's history real quick and fell in love with the character, completely different than I anticipated. And now I love this character, and I understand this character in a way I didn't before, and it's a lot more intriguing and interesting to me. And I was having trouble writing this character to begin with, and it's because I was trying to make the character something that they weren't.
Oh wait, you're back.
Oh.
Hey, you were frozen for a while.
We dropped you for about 1.5 minutes there, dude. So she took over. She's awesome. She's a really
I wasn't taking over.
she's also really humble.
You can pick up from where you started, which was basically
it was really
the beginning of your answer.
Maybe 30 seconds of us doing girl talk and getting caught up on life and stuff. So
she started to say,
backstory is, and then I thought you were doing your Christopher Walken impression because I was for that.
No, I'm not doing that on camera again. So what was I saying? Where did I cut out?
Backstory is.
Backstory is that from the beginning of the episode.
No, we were going through developing and how much is too much. Do we give this information to the readers, or is it just author knowledge? And then you started to say, well, the purpose of backstory is.
That's it. Now I don't even know if I can. Now you guys have been waiting this whole time. What I deliver is not going to be
What a
not going to
build
live
up.
up to your
Epic
expectations.
fail.
But what I was really kind of going on is this idea of when do you create this backstory? How much of it do you need to have before you begin the novel? And I think it's different for each writer. Some people like to discover the backstory as they go. Some people like to know it beforehand. With the Hand of Adonai series, I did a lot of discovery writing, and so I tried to give each character some sort of trait or characteristic or something that I thought was interesting and fascinating, but I didn't tell myself why the characters did what they did, and I had to figure that out as I went along. I've been doing more pre-planning these days, and I just kind of came up with a character that I've been working on for a while. Could not write from this character's perspective because it just was coming out stilted and it just wasn't believable, and it was just kind of an awkward character. When I took the time to go through and figure out backstory, the character completely opened up to me. I had imagined her completely wrong, and now I'm a little bit in love with the way this character has come to be. And just from the initial scene, you get to know her pretty well, and it's a lot more fun to write from her perspective now. So it depends on the writer, and I think it also depends on the project.
Yeah, I mean, I think some people are more pantsers and they'll discover their characters as they go. So they'll see the result of their backstory, and then they have to say, okay, why is she that way? Why does she have a fear of that? Why does she believe this about herself? Why does she have this kind of flaw? That sort of thing. And then the backstory will reveal itself as you write the book, or you can write even the first draft first, and then go back and discover the backstory, and then you can revise your manuscript based on your discovery of your character's story. But for me personally, I like to begin, because I am a character driven novelist, meaning I love characterization. Character is, of course, every story I believe is character driven and plot driven, and I don't think that as a character driven novelist you should neglect plot, and then as a plot driven novelist you shouldn't neglect character. But for me, when I first started writing, it was hard for me to develop a plot, and so I would always begin with character. And now I begin every book that I write by understanding who I'm writing about, by understanding their backstory, because as I do this, then that's what's going to help me to understand their goals for the story, their inner need, as well as their external goal, which are going to play off of each other. And then this is going to help me to create a plot for the whole story. So that's why I begin with discovering the character's backstory. But again, I think it's important, whether you're a plotter or whether you're a pantser, to dig deeper. Don't just settle for just writing your manuscript and not digging a little deeper into your character's past, because as writers, we're almost actors when we're writing, especially when we're writing in deep POV. We have to know our characters so well that we know why they are the way that they are. We understand their motivations, and we understand their worldview, why their worldview has shaped into what it is today, why their personality, the way that they react with others, and also even just a backstory with their relationships, with the setting where they're, wherever they're living, or wherever the setting is of the story. So yeah, it's just important for us to know that, even if some of the backstory doesn't even show up in the manuscript, is still important for us writers to understand the backstory.
I agree.
That is fantastic information. Another question that's not in the show notes, but that I'm thinking, you see a lot of times like sheets for character bios and things of that nature online. Do either of you have an actual template that you use, or a website that you go to help you with your character backstories?
Okay, I use Scrivener, and I have they have character sketches on Scrivener. But I will begin with that, and then I will insert, my own things into the character sketch or whatever. So I don't really use a character chart. I did that when I first started writing, like I did that for Purple Moon, and it does help you brainstorm some ideas, and it does help you to keep the facts of the character organized. And that's why I actually use it now. I like to have everything about the character in one place, so that way I can go back and find these random facts about my character, and then I can incorporate them into the story. And I even have a whole separate document in my character file on Scrivener that's specifically about the character's backstory. So yes, I use the character sketch, I guess is what I would call it. So this contains just the basic surface level kind of information, like fun facts about the characters, where the character grew up, the character's religion, and just in the character's occupation, or if they're in school, the school grade level, and that sort of thing, and also the pictures of the character. But then I really can dig deeper whenever I go into the backstory, and I begin to interview the character and allow her or him to speak to me. And even sometimes I'll even do like journal entries from the character's point of view, which I know, I think it was James Scott Bell who first came up with that idea, even though I'm sure other authors have thought of that too. But it just helps me to understand more about the character, their backstory, and also allows them to speak to me, allows me to hear their voice, which is especially important if you're writing deep POV in that character's perspective.
Yeah, I do. I use it to varying degrees depending on how much I'm using my characters, or how much, for lack of a better term, how much screen time my characters get. The more time I'm going to spend in their POV, the more time I spend developing them.
Do you have your own template that you use, or did you create it? Did you find one on the internet, or?
I've got one. It's kind of a cobbled together from work that I've done and work that some others have done, and I kind of add to it here and there as I see fit. I try and do two things. I try and do basic information so that I can keep things straight, height, weight, eye color, blah, blah, blah. Normal stuff so that I can kind of make sure that I'm consistent with description. But then I really try and maximize what I'm figuring out about my character. I've shared before, one of the most powerful things is like the worst thing your character has ever said.
Wow.
Yeah, that's in addition to their strengths, their weaknesses, their flaws, personality types. Where are they uncomfortable? What's the biggest challenge they've overcome? What's their greatest success? What's their greatest failure? Those types of things. And allowing yourselves to just write a little bit of paragraph information about each of those can be pretty enlightening, pretty powerful.
Thanks for that little divergence.
Yeah, it helps to go deep. I know a lot of writers, they might just stick with surface level facts about the character, which sometimes that's what's the only questions that are on the character charts are surface level. But it's important to really go deep into the heart and the soul of the character, especially if you are writing in that deep point of view.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that brings me to the next section, which is describe ways that we can develop our characters and their history or backstory. And can you pick one character that you have written to use as an example for that? Tessa, why don't you go ahead and start?
So I basically kind of was already going over this, but I like to, interview with my character and allow them to speak basically their past to me. It either happens that way, or I first discover what it is, like what their fear is or what is their inner need first. And then I say, okay, why are you that way? And then they'll speak to me, they'll give me the answer. And then I'll take it a step further and say, okay, why? And so you just keep basically asking why until you hear them tell you the story of why do they have this flaw, or why do they believe this lie about themselves? So the whole thing is just allow them to speak these stories to you. And I don't know about a specific example. Do you mean like give an example of a character that I've created?
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, I don't know. I guess you could say with Cassie, my main character in Unwritten Melody, that's what I did. Actually, that book is written from two perspectives, Cassie and James. And with both of them, that's basically the same thing that happened. Like I gave both of them an internal goal, an internal struggle, and then I wanted them to tell me the story about about why they are the way that they are. Like for instance, James, the one of the main characters, he has issues with his dad in that relationship, and so in order to understand that, and in order to understand the insecurities that he had, it was all stemmed from his relationship with his dad. And so I had to uncover his backstory and uncover what it is that calls their relationship to not be the greatest relationship, and that sort of thing. And even though those stories don't always manifest into the story, again, it's important for us writers to understand why they are the way that they are, and it just helps the characters to come across as flesh and blood rather than just names on a page.
I like that. Erin, what about you? You've got a handful of characters floating around out there right now. Do you have any particular one or group of characters that you worked their backstory in quite nicely?
The one that comes to mind is Erica. She's the one in my Hand of Adonai series, and she wears gloves. She always wears gloves even when it's hot, and they're not exactly clever or fashionable gloves. It's just something that she does, and it becomes a thing. Why she wears these gloves? I had no idea why she wears them. And through the process of discovery, it became clear to me, and the answer was surprising to me. It was surprising to me, but I think it was very, very powerful in that way. And so Eric is the one that just really comes to mind, but I've done this for other ones. Lauren's character was shaped by coming up with the worst thing that she'd ever said. That actually made its way into book 1. Erica's backstory made its way into book 2 in the Hand of Adonai series in the very, in the opening chapters. Aiden's story comes out a little bit more in the book that is released on March 15th, The Seven Seals. If you're interested more in Aiden's backstory, you'll get to see some of it there. And his character really gets a lot deeper. But I like to encourage myself to think that my characters have secrets even from me. And so I try and figure out as much as I can, but then I always try and surprise myself at some point. That way I try not to be like too stereotypical, too cliche with stuff. I come back to the first line of Anna Karenina. Every happy family is happy in the same way. Every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. And so it's very easy to think of these, troubled pasts that our characters have had. And it's very easy to say they had a drunk father, but we've seen so many characters with drunk fathers, and all the drunk fathers act the same way. They're not. They're very different. We know that from Good Will Hunting, which I don't recommend because there's a lot of bad language in it. But if you want to talk about character study, woo, that movie is something else. And it really hones in on that idea that not everybody, the unhappiness that we experience is uniquely our own. And so that I try and lean on that and think, how is this person's backstory different than anybody else's backstory? And that tries to that helps set my characters apart.
Nice. I like that. For myself, obviously I've only written one novel, so it would be my characters in NOLA. Definitely Rain, my male protagonist, took me by surprise. As I was writing him into the book, I kind of knew his backstory, but not a lot. And as I wrote Josie, or Penny is her real name. She's nicknamed Josie. But as I was writing Josie's journey into New Orleans and discovering New Orleans as a city and her companions and learning more, I was learning more about the people she was hanging out with, which is Rain and his friend Tony, his brother Lou. And so their backstories kind of took me by surprise. But now Josie's story, I knew right away. I didn't write any of it out until I was about 2/3 done with the book. I mean, right, like in a bio sheet or anything like that. But I definitely knew her backstory, other than a couple of things that I said took me by surprise. But in writing her character true to the backstory, those other elements should not have surprised me. But it was almost unavoidable of what was going on in her head and what she was thinking, what she was saying and doing, and sort of thing. So I think backstory is obviously very essential, because without it, you, like you guys have been saying, you don't have that complete fullness of character. You don't have that ability to give the reader what they need to understand why the character, and even in the antagonists, you need some of that. You can't just throw a guy in there who's going to be upsetting the world and that's the end of it, so there has to be a reason. Why is he a bad guy? And he's not always going to be 100% bad. So what is the bad aspect? What is the negative aspect, and how does that come into play because of who he is through his backstory? It's not just for the protagonists.
Yeah, it's the decisions that they made yesterday that make them who they are today. And so I think that's really something important to remember as we develop their backstory, is that, who they are today is just a result of yesterday. And also it's their backstory helps to form their internal goals and their internal struggles, their fears and their lies as well. And like the lies that they believe about themselves. And for me, that's another reason why it's so important to begin with backstory. I think I am jumping ahead a little bit on the notes, but
actually, you're right on target.
Okay. Another reason why it's important for me to begin with backstory is because it does help me to shape the external journey that my character takes throughout the story. So I was saying earlier how I'm a character-driven novelist, and so I love, just first sitting down and getting to know my characters, and then the story will present itself that way. But instead of first deciding on the plot events, I first begin with the character's inner journey that she's going to take throughout the story. And again, that manifests itself as I learn more about her past. So for example, in my second book, Unwritten Melody, my main character, Cassie, her inner need is for freedom. She longs to have freedom. And it's because she grew up in a very sheltered home, and her outer goal, I guess, is related to her inner goal, because her external goal is that she wants to break free of her strict grandmother's, the rules that she set for herself. She wants, and that's just a reflection of her inner need, which is to have freedom. And she wants to be able to become an average teenager. And then I would say that the lie that she believes about herself is she's always, and this is sort of a flaw as well, she's believed that she doesn't have a purpose for her life. And the reason why she believes that, which that directs the course of the story, and it comes into play especially near the end of the book, and it affects the entire theme of the book. But the reason she believes that is because of a significant event that happened to her in her past. And so being able to understand what that event was helps me to steer the course of the entire story, and it'll present itself organically as I write the book too.
I like that. That's informative. You mentioned the phrase character-driven novelists. Mm-hmm. Can either of you explain for readers what that means?
A character-driven novel, I think there's really two differences. Character-driven novel is going to be one that is more about a character's journey than necessarily external events, though external conflicts can be part of shaping the internal journey that a character takes. But usually the focus is more on the character development, rather than more of a plot-driven novel, which is more of like kind of I don't know, it's like a mystery, it's a MacGuffin. You got kind of the big high concept. I think of it like some of the blockbuster films. You have a lot of special effects, a lot of money in it, and a lot of wow factor, but sometimes the story just isn't as strong. You go and see the movie just because it's fun to watch. You don't go to be challenged. Whereas character-driven novels are more about an internal struggle.
Yeah, it's definitely, I would say, the same thing, that character-driven books, a lot of literary fiction books are character-driven because they're very focused on the inside world of the character and the character development, the character growth. Of course, every book needs to have that plot and some kind of character arc, and they need to focus on, every story needs to focus on making sure that you have developed characters and that sort of thing. But for some people, the plot events comes first. Like for my friend who is also an author, she writes, her name's Caroline George, and she writes YA, like sci-fi and that sort of thing. And she can just brainstorm a lot of plot events that I can't brainstorm without first figuring out the internal arc of my character. And so that's how I would pretty much define character driven as well. Just basically, developing the internal journey, just really focus on the internal journey that the character takes.
Yeah, excellent. So, and that's really something that we're going to look at more next time. We are a little bit long on this one, but that's okay. This is a really good topic. This is our first one back, and so just happy to be here. So next time we are going to be looking at the difference between character-driven versus plot-driven, and how you can have the external plot kind of shape the internal journey that your characters take. And both Tessa and I kind of consider ourselves character-driven novelists, and so we've got some insight there. But we do thank you for joining us. Molly, am I doing the sign-off?
Sure, I will do the sign-off.
Okay.
Thanks for joining us, and you can find us and follow us at eringansky.com, TessaEmilyHall.com, and MollyJoReilly.com. Also follow us on Facebook and Twitter. All those links are going to be in the show notes. And then remember to submit your questions for Ask the Author. See you next time.
Bye.
Bye, guys.